Listen, can you hear it? The sound of ice melting, of glaciers retreating like ancient titans withdrawing from the world. 10,000 years before our time, the great sheets of ice that had locked the earth in crystalline sleep began their long goodbye. The rivers, freed from their frozen prison, carved new paths through valleys and plains, carrying with them the dreams of a world yet to be born. In the land between two rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, something extraordinary was about to unfold. The waters flowed steadily now, predictably, creating a ribbon of green life through what would otherwise be desert. Here, in this cradle between flowing waters, humanity would take its first tentative steps towards something that had never existed before: civilization. For countless generations, humans had wandered. They followed the herds across endless grasslands, gathered fruits that ripened with the seasons, and made temporary shelters wherever night found them. They were nomads, children of the wind, owning nothing but what they could carry, leaving no mark upon the earth save their footprints, which the next rain would wash away. But something was changing in the hearts of these wanderers. Perhaps it was the sight of wild wheat swaying in the Mesopotamian breeze, or the way certain seeds, when dropped near their campsites, would sprout into familiar plants. Perhaps it was simply time for humanity to dream a different dream. The first farmers appeared like quiet revolutionaries. They didn't set out to change the world, they simply noticed that seeds, when planted deliberately, produced more food than random gathering ever could. They began to clear small patches of land, to tend their crops, to wait through the long months between planting and harvest. And in that waiting, something fundamental shifted in the human soul. For the first time in the history of our species, people began to think beyond tomorrow. They had to. A farmer who plants grain in spring must plan for autumn, must store seed for next year's planting, must imagine a future that stretches beyond the immediate horizon. The act of agriculture required not just physical labor, but mental transformation, the birth of human patience, planning, and hope. Along the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates, these early farmers discovered something that would change everything: the power of irrigation. The rivers flooded predictably each year, depositing rich silt across the floodplains, but the timing wasn't always perfect for growing crops. So they began to dig, simple channels at first, then more complex networks of canals and dikes. With each shovelful of earth, they were digging the foundation of civilization itself. For irrigation required cooperation on a scale never before attempted. A single family might tend a small garden, but managing the flow of rivers demanded the coordinated effort of entire communities. Someone had to decide when to open the water channels, how to distribute the precious liquid fairly, how to maintain the canals when silt threatened to clog them. And so, almost accidentally, the first governments were born. Not from conquest or domination, but from the simple necessity of managing shared water. The priest-kings of these early settlements weren't warriors at first. They were coordinators, negotiators, the keepers of the irrigation schedule that meant the difference between abundance and famine. The settlements grew: Tel Es Sarwan, Chogamami, and dozens of other small communities that we know now only as mounds of earth hiding ancient secrets. But these weren't mere villages. They were experiments in a new way of being human. For the first time, people lived in permanent houses, built to last for generations. They could accumulate possessions, create art, develop specialized skills. Some became potters, learning to shape clay with their hands and fire it into vessels that would last for centuries. Others became weavers, creating textiles that turned functional clothing into expressions of beauty. Still others became metalworkers, discovering that certain rocks, when heated to tremendous temperatures, yielded copper and bronze that could be shaped into tools more durable than any stone. The pottery wheel appeared, that simple yet revolutionary device that transformed clay working from a slow hand-building process into something approaching mass production. Around and around the wheel spun, and on it, clay vessels took shape with a perfection and speed that seemed almost magical. The rhythmic turning of the wheel, The gentle pressure of skilled hands, the gradual emergence of form from formless clay. It was like watching creation itself in miniature. But perhaps the most remarkable invention of these early centuries was the temple. Not just buildings, but ideas made manifest in mud, brick, and stone. The first temples were simple structures raised slightly above the surrounding houses, but they represented something profound: the human need to create sacred space, to acknowledge powers greater than themselves, to build something that reached toward heaven. The Ubaid period, archaeologists call it now, but to the people living through it, it was simply the time when the world made sense. Communities grew around their temples, and the priests who served the gods became the administrators of increasingly complex societies. They organized the harvest, distributed surplus food, settled disputes, and kept the records that would eventually evolve into the world's first writing systems. These priest-kings weren't distant rulers, but integral parts of their communities. They lived in larger houses, yes, and wore finer clothing, but they were still neighbors who shared the same concerns about weather and crops, floods and droughts. Social stratification was beginning, the first tentative steps toward the class systems that would define later civilizations, but it was still gentle, still rooted in function rather than pure power. Population grew steadily. Success in agriculture meant more food, which meant more people could be supported, which meant more hands to work the fields and dig the canals. It was a virtuous cycle that would continue for millennia, driving the growth of ever larger communities and ever more sophisticated technologies. Trade networks began to emerge. A farmer in one settlement might have surplus grain but need new tools. A metalworker in another community might have bronze to spare but require additional food. Slowly, tentatively, people began to venture beyond their familiar territories, carrying goods and ideas across the growing web of interconnected communities. The invention of sailing vessels transformed these trade networks, no longer dependent on the speed of human feet or the carrying capacity of pack animals. Merchants could move heavy goods up and down the rivers with relative ease. The sight of a sailboat appearing around a bend in the river, its cargo hold filled with exotic materials from distant lands, became a symbol of the expanding world that was taking shape. Rivers became highways of commerce and communication. News traveled along with goods, information about new farming techniques, religious practices, artistic styles, and political developments. The isolated communities of the early agricultural period began to merge into something larger, a regional culture with shared technologies, beliefs, and aspirations. Children born in these later Ubaid settlements would never know the wandering life of their ancestors. They grew up in houses with solid walls, in communities with established, shared traditions. In a world where the future seemed predictable and secure, they learned specialized skills from their parents, worshipped in temples that had stood for generations, and dreamed dreams that stretched beyond the horizon. The stage was set for something unprecedented in human history, the birth of the city. All the elements were in place: intensive agriculture, complex irrigation systems, specialized crafts, long-distance trade, social hierarchy, and religious institutions. What was needed now was the spark that would ignite these separate elements into the blazing fire of urban civilization. That spark would come from the south, from the marshlands where the Tigris and Euphrates approached the sea. There, in the humid lowlands that seemed least promising for human habitation, a people would emerge who would give the world its first cities, its first writing, its first literature, and its first glimpse of what humanity might become when it dared to dream on an unprecedented scale. As the first temple rose from the mud, dedicated to gods whose names were already ancient, the stage was set for humanity's greatest experiment, the city. The rivers flowed on, carrying silt and stories, dreams and debris, toward a future that would astonish even the gods themselves. From the southern marshlands, where the great rivers met the sea, a new sound arose, not the familiar rhythm of farming or the gentle splash of irrigation channels, but something unprecedented, the bustle of the world's first cities. The The Sumerians, as we call them now, emerged from the reedy wetlands like a dream becoming flesh, bringing with them innovations that would transform not just Mesopotamia, but the entire human experience. Uruk rose first, a cluster of mud brick buildings that grew and spread until it covered nearly 6 square kilometers, larger than any settlement the world had ever seen. Walking through its streets for the first time, a visitor from the older farm, Ian communities would have felt overwhelming wonder. Here were buildings that reached toward heaven, streets that stretched beyond the horizon, and people whose lives were devoted not to growing food, but to crafts and trades that earlier generations could barely imagine. The ziggurat of Anu dominated the city's skyline, its massive tiers ascending step by step toward the realm of the gods. This wasn't simply a large building, it was a revolutionary concept made manifest in brick and mortar. The Sumerians had dared to build a mountain where none existed, creating a sacred peak that connected earth to heaven. From its summit, priests could commune with the gods, while the city spread below them like a living map of human ambition. But perhaps the most revolutionary invention to emerge from Uruk wasn't architectural, it was intellectual. Somewhere in the city's administrative quarters, a scribe made the first tentative marks that would evolve into cuneiform writing. These weren't drawings or pictures, but abstract symbols that represented sounds and ideas. For the first time in human history, thoughts could be captured and preserved, freed from the limitations of memory and the fragility of human life. The earliest tablets were simple records, lists of grain, counts of livestock, records of transactions. But within these mundane documents lay the seeds of something extraordinary, the possibility of immortality through writing. A person's words, once committed to clay, could outlive their body, their children, even their entire civilization. The Sumerians had discovered how to cheat death itself. Writing spread like wildfire through the growing cities. Scribes became a new class of professionals, their skills as valuable as those of craftsmen or merchants. Schools emerged to teach the complex art of cuneiform, and with education came the first literature. The stories that had once been told around campfires were now preserved in clay, growing more elaborate with each retelling. The Epic of Gilgamesh took shape in these early centuries, humanity's first great work of literature, the story of a king who sought immortality but learned to accept mortality instead resonated through the ages. Gilgamesh's journey from arrogant ruler to wise king paralleled humanity's own evolution from simple farmers to complex urban dwellers. In his quest for eternal life, the Sumerians explored the deepest questions of human existence. What does it mean to be mortal? How should we live knowing that we must die? What legacy can we leave behind? The cities multiplied across the southern plain, with its magnificent royal cemetery and towering ziggurat dedicated to the moon god Nana. Eridu, the oldest of all cities according to Sumerian legend, where the god Enki first taught humanity the arts of civilization. Lagash, Umma, Nippur, each city-state was a world unto itself, complete with its own patron deity, its own government, its own army. These weren't mere towns that had grown large, but entirely new forms of human organization. The Sumerian city-state was a complex organism with specialized parts. Farmers who grew the food, craftsmen who made the tools, merchants who traded with distant lands, soldiers who protected the walls, priests who maintained the temples, and kings who coordinated it all. For the first time, a single community could support people whose entire lives were devoted to activities unrelated to food production. The technological innovations came in a torrent. The potter's wheel, already known in the earlier periods, was refined to new levels of sophistication. Sumerian potters could create vessels of extraordinary beauty and precision, their surfaces decorated with intricate patterns that spoke of leisure time and artistic sensibility. The wheel itself was adapted for transportation, revolutionizing trade and warfare. Suddenly, heavy goods sea would be moved with ease, and armies could mobilize with unprecedented speed. Sailing technology advanced dramatically, The Sumerians developed the first true sailboats, capable of navigating not just the calm waters of rivers, but the choppy waters of the Persian Gulf. Their merchants sailed to distant lands, bringing back exotic materials and new ideas. From the mountains of Afghanistan came lapis lazuli, that blue stone so prized it was worth more than gold. From the forests of Lebanon came cedarwood, precious in a land where trees were scarce. From the Indus Valley came ivory and pearls, proof that Sumerian influence extended far beyond Mesopotamia. The plough transformed agriculture. No longer did farmers have to break the soil with simple hoes and digging sticks. Teams of oxen could now pull metal plowshares through the earth, turning over far more ground in a single day than had been possible before. The increased efficiency meant that fewer people could produce more food, freeing others to pursue specialized crafts and trades. Mathematics and astronomy flourished in the Sumerian cities. The priests who managed the temples needed to keep careful track of time, both for religious festivals and for agricultural planning. They divided the year into 12 months, the day into 24 hours, and the hour into 60 minutes. They created the first calendar based on careful observation of the moon's phases and the sun's movement through the sky. Sumerian astronomers identified the planets, mapped the constellations, and predicted eclipses with remarkable accuracy. Their mathematical system, based on the number 60, was so sophisticated that we still use it today when we measure time and angles. The concept of place notation, the idea that a symbol's position determines its value, was a breakthrough that would eventually make complex calculations possible. The Sumerian pantheon was as complex as their society. Each city had its patron god, but all acknowledged the authority of the great gods who ruled the cosmos. Anu, the sky god, reigned supreme. Enlil, the god of wind and storm, controlled the weather that meant life or death to farmers. Ea, the god of wisdom and water, taught humanity the arts of civilization. Inanna, the goddess of love and war, embodied the passionate contradictions of human nature. These gods weren't distant abstractions, but active participants in daily life. They owned the land, and the king was merely their earthly representative. The great temples weren't just places of worship, but economic centers that controlled vast estates, employed thousands of workers, and served as banks for the entire community. The priests who served these gods were among the most powerful people in society, their blessing essential for any important undertaking. The Sumerian king was both ruler and high priest, responsible for maintaining the relationship between the human and divine worlds. The earliest kings seem to have been war leaders, chosen temporarily to defend their cities against external threats. But as the cities grew larger and more complex, kingship became permanent and hereditary. The king's palace rivaled the temple in size and magnificence, reflecting the growing importance of secular power. Royal burials became elaborate affairs, demonstrating the king's divine status. The royal cemetery at Ur, with its magnificent grave goods and evidence of human sacrifice, shows how far Sumerian society had evolved from its egalitarian origins. When a king died, his servants followed him into the afterlife, a practice that would have been unthinkable in earlier periods when communities were small and every life was precious. Trade networks expanded across the known world. Sumerian merchants established trading posts, TS from the Mediterranean to the Indus Valley, creating the first truly international economy. They developed standardized weights and measures, making commerce possible across vast distances. They created the first contracts, legal documents that specified the terms of business agreements and provided recourse when disputes arose. The Sumerian city-states were rarely at peace with each other. Competition for water rights, trade routes, and agricultural land led to constant warfare, but these conflicts also drove innovation. Sumerian armies developed new weapons, new tactics, and new forms of military organization. The war chariot, pulled by donkeys and later by horses, gave armies new mobility and striking power. Yet for all their military prowess, the Sumerians were fundamentally builders, not destroyers. They created the first schools, the first libraries, the first hospitals. They developed the first system of laws, Based on the principle that justice should be predictable and fair, they created the first postal system, allowing messages to travel across their trade networks with unprecedented speed. The Sumerian legacy extended far beyond their political boundaries. Their cuneiform script was adapted by dozens of other languages. Their mathematical and astronomical knowledge spread throughout the ancient world. Their literary traditions influenced cultures from Egypt to India. Their concept of kingship, their legal principles, and their religious ideas shaped the development of civilization for millennia. From the palace of Uruk, kings gazed upon a world of city-states, each believing itself the center of creation, unaware that a northern people were sharpening their weapons and dreaming of empire. The Sumerians had shown humanity what was possible when communities grew large enough to support specialization and sophisticated enough to coordinate complex activity. Yes, they had created the template for civilization itself, but they had also unleashed forces they couldn't control. The wealth of the cities attracted the attention of peoples who lived simpler lives but possessed greater military strength. The complex irrigation systems that supported urban populations were vulnerable to disruption. The trade networks that brought prosperity also brought enemies who coveted Sumerian wealth. The great experiment was about to face its first test. Could a civilization built on cooperation and shared prosperity survive in a world where force often determined outcomes? The answer would come from the north, where a people called the Akkadians were learning to combine Sumerian sophistication with military innovation in ways that would transform the ancient world. In the reeds along the Euphrates, a baby cried. According to legend, his mother placed him in a basket of rushes sealed with bitumen and cast him onto the river's current. The waters carried him downstream to where a gardener named Aki found him and raised him as his own son. This child, rescued from the river like Moses would be centuries later, would grow to become Sargon of Akkad, the first man to unite the quarreling city-states of Mesopotamia under a single crown. The story may be legend, but the man was real enough. Sargon emerged from obscurity in the northern regions of Mesopotamia, where Semitic-speaking peoples had long lived alongside and intermarried with the Sumerians. He rose through the ranks to become cupbearer to the king of Kish, a position that gave him access to the corridors of power and insight into the weaknesses of the existing system. The Sumerian city-states, for all their cultural achievements, were trapped in a cycle of endless conflict. Each city jealously guarded its independence. Each king claimed divine mandate to rule, and each generation seemed to produce new reasons for warfare. Trade suffered, resources were wasted on military campaigns, and the constant fighting weakened all parties involved. The system that had created civilization's greatest early achievements was becoming its greatest obstacle. Sargon saw opportunity in this chaos. Unlike the Sumerian kings who sought to dominate their neighbors while maintaining the old system of competing city-states, Sargon envisioned something unprecedented, a single state that would encompass all of Mesopotamia. It was a revolutionary idea that would require revolutionary methods. The Akkadian military machine that Sargon built was unlike anything the world had seen. Where Sumerian armies were largely part-time forces of citizen soldiers, Sargon created the first professional army in history. His soldiers were full-time warriors whose loyalty was to him personally rather than to any particular city or god. They were armed with the composite bow, a technological marvel that could launch arrows with devastating accuracy at ranges far beyond traditional weapons. The composite bow was itself a symbol of Akkadian innovation. Made from wood, horn, and sinew laminated together, it was lighter and more powerful than simple wooden bows. Its construction required sophisticated craftsmanship and careful attention to detail, but the result was a weapon that gave its wielder enormous advantages in battle. A skilled archer with a composite bow could strike enemies before they could close to fighting distance. Sargon's conquest of Sumer began with careful diplomacy. He formed alliances with cities that felt threatened by their stronger neighbors, offered protection to trade routes that had been disrupted by warfare, and presented himself as a peacemaker who would end the destructive cycle of conflict. But when diplomacy failed, he was prepared to use force with devastating effectiveness. The siege of Uruk marked the beginning of the end for Sumerian independence. The great city that had been the birthplace of urban civilization found itself surrounded by professional soldiers who were equipped with advanced weapons and led by a commander who understood both strategy and logistics. The siege lasted months, but eventually Uruk's walls were breached and the city fell to Akkadian forces. One by one, the other Sumerian cities followed: Ur, Lagash, Umma, Eridu, each proud city-state that had maintained its independence for over 1,000 years found itself incorporated into Sargon's growing empire. The conquest wasn't merely military, it was cultural and administrative as well. Sargon left local rulers in place where possible, but he installed Akkadian governors to ensure loyalty and imposed a unified administrative system that superseded local traditions. The genius of Sargon's system lay in its combination of centralized control with local autonomy. He understood that trying to govern the diverse peoples of Mesopotamia through pure force would be both ineffective and expensive. Instead, he created a hybrid system that preserved much of local culture while establishing overarching imperial authority. Sumerian remained the language of learning and religion, but Akkadian became the language of administration and trade. The unification of Mesopotamia unleashed economic forces that had been constrained by the old system of competing city-states. Trade routes that had been disrupted by warfare were secured and expanded. Standardized weights and measures were established across the empire. A single currency facilitated commerce from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. The result was an unprecedented period of prosperity that extended far beyond Mesopotamia's borders. Sargon's empire stretched from the Zagros Mountains to the Mediterranean coast, from the He, glands of Anatolia to the shores of the Persian Gulf. It was the first true empire in human history, and its influence extended even beyond its political boundaries. Akkadian merchants established trading posts in distant lands, Akkadian cultural practices spread throughout the ancient Near East, and Akkadian became the diplomatic language of international relations. The capital city of Akkad, built by Sargon to serve as the center of his empire, became the largest city in the world. Though its exact location remains unknown to modern archaeologists, ancient texts describe it as a marvel of urban planning and architectural achievement. The palace complex alone was said to cover several square kilometers, with gardens, courtyards, and administrative buildings that demonstrated the wealth and power of the Akkadian state. But perhaps Sargon's greatest achievement was cultural rather than political. He managed to fuse Sumerian and Akkadian traditions into a new synthesis that preserved the best of both while creating something entirely original. Akkadian scribes adapted cuneiform writing to their own language, creating a literary tradition that would influence the ancient world for millennia. Akkadian artists combined Sumerian themes with their own aesthetic sensibilities, producing works of extraordinary beauty and power. The reign of Sargon lasted for over 50 years, a remarkable achievement in an age when most rulers were fortunate to survive a single decade. He passed the empire to his sons, establishing a dynasty that would rule for more than 2 centuries. But the seeds of the empire's eventual destruction were present from the beginning. Ruling an empire required constant vigilance and enormous resources. The professional army that had won the empire needed to be maintained, and maintaining a large standing army was expensive. The administrative system that governed the diverse peoples of the empire required skilled bureaucrats who needed to be paid. The capital city that served as the empire's center needed to be supplied with food and materials from across the known world. Under Sargon's successors, the empire continued to expand. His grandson, Naram-Sin, pushed the boundaries even further, conquering new territories and subduing new peoples. But Naram-Sin also made a crucial error that would haunt the dynasty. He declared himself a god, claiming divine status that had traditionally been reserved for the rulers of the afterlife. This declaration of divinity wasn't merely a matter of ego or ambition. In the ancient world, the relationship between rulers and gods was complex and carefully regulated. Kings were considered to be the gods' representatives on earth, but they were still mortal beings who owed their authority to divine favor. By claiming to be a god himself, Naram-Sin challenged the fundamental assumptions that legitimized royal power. The psychological impact of this declaration was profound. If the king was a god, then rebellion against him was not just treason, but sacrilege. But if he was indeed divine, why did he need armies to enforce his will? Why did the empire face constant rebellions and external threats? The claim to divinity raised expectations that no mortal ruler could fulfill. The empire also faced practical challenges that grew more severe with each passing generation. The irrigation systems that supported Mesopotamian agriculture required constant maintenance, and the disruption caused by constant warfare was beginning to tell. Climate change, possibly caused by a volcanic eruption or other natural disaster, led to a period of reduced rainfall that stressed the agricultural system that fed the empire's cities. External pressures mounted as well. The Gutians, a mountain people from the Zagros, launched increasingly bold raids into Mesopotamian territory. These weren't the organized conquests of civilized armies, but destructive incursions that devastated the countryside and disrupted trade. The Akkadian military, designed for large-scale battles between professional armies, proved less effective against guerrilla tactics and hit-and-run raids. Internal rebellions became more frequent and more serious. The Sumerian cities, never fully reconciled to Akkadian rule, seized every opportunity to reassert their independence. Local governors who had been loyal to Sargon began to act more like independent rulers, keeping more of their province's revenue for themselves and providing less support to the central government. The empire's trade networks, which had been a source of strength, became a vulnerability. Disruption of trade routes by warfare or natural disasters had cascading effects throughout the system. Cities that had become dependent on imported goods found themselves unable to obtain essential supplies. The complex administrative system that had managed the empire's resources broke down as communication became difficult and unreliable. The final collapse came suddenly, like a dam breaking under pressure that had been building for decades. The Gutians swept down from the mountains in a series of devastating raids that the weakened Akkadian forces could not repel. The capital city of Akkad was sacked and burned, its population scattered to the winds. The empire that had taken generations to build was destroyed in a matter of years. Naram-Sin's son, Shah Kali Shari, tried desperately to hold the empire together, but he was fighting a losing battle. Provincial governors declared their independence, cities fell to barbarian raids, and the central government's authority collapsed. By 2054 BC, the Akkadian Empire was no more, leaving behind only ruins and memories of humanity's first attempt at universal rule. The legacy of Sargon and his dynasty extended far beyond their political achievements. They had demonstrated that it was possible to unite diverse peoples under a single government, to create economic systems that transcended local boundaries, and to project power across vast distances. They had shown that empire was not only possible, but could be profitable and beneficial to those who participated in it. The Akkadian period also established patterns that would recur throughout the history of Mesopotamia and the ancient world. The cycle of imperial rise and fall, the tension between centralized authority and local autonomy, the challenges of maintaining complex systems across vast territories. These themes would be repeated by every subsequent empire that arose in the region. As Akkadian power crumbled like clay in the rain, the old gods stirred in their temples, and the Sumerian scribes began to write once more of the ancient days when the world was young. The dream of universal empire had been born, and though this first attempt had failed, the dream itself would never die. Future conquerors would study the Akkadian example, learning from both their successes and their failures, as they attempted to build their own versions of Sargon's revolutionary vision. In In the darkness that followed the collapse of the Akkadian Empire, something remarkable happened. Like flowers pushing through the rubble of a destroyed building, the old Sumerian culture began to bloom again. The Gutians, those mountain raiders who had brought down the world's first empire, proved to be destroyers rather than builders. They could sack cities, and scatter armies, but they had no vision for governing the sophisticated civilization they had conquered. The Sumerian Renaissance began in the most unlikely of places, the small city-state of Lagash, far from the great centers of power that had dominated earlier periods. Here, a ruler named Gudea came to power with a vision that seemed almost anachronistic in an age of imperial ambition and military conquest. Gudea was a builder, not a conqueror, a patron of the arts rather than a warrior king. He looked backward to the golden age of Sumerian civilization and forward to a future where cultural achievement would once again take precedence over military might. Gudea's reign was marked by an extraordinary building program that transformed Lagash into a showcase of Sumerian artistry and religious devotion. He commissioned temples, statues, and public works that demonstrated both his piety and his wealth. The famous statues of Gudea, carved from expensive diorite imported from distant lands, show him in the traditional pose of a Sumerian ruler, hands clasped in prayer, eyes raised toward heaven, completely devoted to the service of the gods. These statues weren't mere decoration, but statements of political philosophy. In an age when many rulers claimed divine status for themselves, Gudea presented himself as the humble servant of the gods, a mortal man whose authority came from his devotion rather than his military power. He ruled by moral example rather than force, creating a model of kingship that harked back to the earliest days of Sumerian civilization. The cultural revival that began in Lagash spread gradually to other cities that had survived the Gutian devastation. Scribes who had hidden their tablets during the dark years brought them out again, copying ancient texts and composing new works that celebrated the enduring values of Sumerian civilization. Artists who had fled the destroyed cities returned to their workshops, creating sculptures and relief carvings that combined traditional themes with new techniques. The religious revival was particularly significant. The great temples that had been abandoned or destroyed during the Gutian period were rebuilt with extraordinary attention to detail. The ancient rituals that had been interrupted were restored, performed with a devotion that seemed to reflect the community's gratitude for having survived the dark years. The gods who had seemed to abandon their people during the time of troubles were welcomed back with ceremonies of unprecedented magnificence. It was from this cultural renewal that the third dynasty of Ur emerged. Ur-Nammu, the founder of the dynasty, was a military leader who had learned from the Akkadian example while remaining true to Sumerian values. He understood that lasting power required more than military conquest. It needed cultural legitimacy and religious sanction. He presented himself not as a revolutionary like Sargon, but as a restorer of the ancient order. The unification of Sumer under Ur-Nammu's leadership was achieved through a combination of military success and cultural appeal. Cities that had suffered under Gutian rule welcomed the prospect of returning to the old ways, while the promise of restored trade and prosperity won over merchants and craftsmen. The dynasty that emerged was consciously Sumerian in its cultural orientation, even though it incorporated many of the administrative innovations that had made the Akkadian Empire possible. The great ziggurat of Ur, built by Ur-Nammu and completed by his son Shulgi, stands as the supreme achievement of this final Sumerian Renaissance. Rising in 3 great tiers toward the sky, it was larger and more magnificent than any previous ziggurat. Its construction required the coordinated labor of thousands of workers over many years, demonstrating the state's organizational capacity and economic strength. But the ziggurat was more than just an impressive building. It was a symbol of Sumerian civilization's enduring vitality. At a time when other cultures were turning toward militarism and imperial expansion, the Sumerians were still building monuments to their gods. still reaching toward heaven with structures that were designed to last for eternity. The ziggurat embodied the Sumerian belief that the proper relationship between humanity and the divine was one of service and devotion rather than conquest and domination. The legal achievements of the Third Dynasty were equally impressive. The Code of Ur-Nammu, predating the more famous Code of Hammurabi by several centuries, established principles of justice that would influence legal thinking for millennia. Unlike later legal codes that emphasized punishment and retribution, the Sumerian laws focused on compensation and restoration. The goal was not to destroy the wrongdoer, but to restore balance to the community. The bureaucratic achievements of the dynasty were perhaps even more remarkable than its architectural and legal accomplishments. The archives of the Third Dynasty of Ur contain tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets that record the daily operations of government with unprecedented detail. These tablets document everything from the allocation of rations to temple workers to the organization of military campaigns, providing modern scholars with an intimate view of how a Bronze Age state actually functioned. The level of bureaucratic sophistication revealed in these archives is staggering. The government maintained detailed records of agricultural production, tracked the movement of goods across the empire, and managed the complex logistics of supporting a large urban population. The scribes who created these records were skilled professionals who used standardized forms and procedures that ensured consistency and accuracy across the entire administrative system. The economic prosperity that supported this administrative marvel was based on a combination of agricultural productivity and long-distance trade. The irrigation systems that had been damaged during the Gutian period were not only restored, but expanded and improved. New canals were dug, existing waterways were deepened, and sophisticated water management techniques were developed that maximized agricultural output. Trade networks were rebuilt and extended, connecting Ur with partners from the Mediterranean to the Indus Valley. Sumerian merchants once again became familiar figures in distant markets, their goods prized for their quality and their business practices trusted for their reliability. The prosperity that resulted from this commercial revival supported not only the government's ambitious building programs, but also a flowering of artistic and literary achievement. The literature of the Third Dynasty period represents the final flowering of Sumerian creativity. The great myths and epics that had been composed in earlier periods were collected, edited, and preserved in authoritative versions. New hymns were composed celebrating the gods and the kings who served them. Wisdom literature emerged that reflected on the proper conduct of life and the relationship between mortals and the divine. The Lamentations, a unique genre of Sumerian literature, emerged during this period as well. These were extended poems that mourned the destruction of cities and the suffering of their inhabitants. They reflected a mature understanding of the cyclical nature of history and the inevitability of change and loss. The Lamentations weren't merely expressions of grief, but sophisticated literary works that explored the deeper meaning of human suffering and divine justice. The school system that developed during this period was the most advanced the ancient world had yet seen. Young scribes were trained not only in the practical skills of reading and writing, but also in literature, mathematics, and religious knowledge. The curriculum included memorization of classical texts, practice in various forms of composition, and instruction in the complex calculations required for administrative work. These schools produced a class of educated professionals who were capable of managing the increasingly complex operations of government and commerce. They were also the guardians of Sumerian cultural traditions, ensuring that the language, literature, and religious practices of their ancestors would be preserved for future generations. But even as Sumerian culture reached new heights of achievement, the political foundations of the state were weakening. The Third Dynasty faced many of the same challenges that had brought down the Akkadian Empire: the difficulty of governing distant territories, the expense of maintaining professional armies, and the constant threat of rebellion and invasion. The Elamites, a people from the mountains east of Mesopotamia, launched increasingly bold attacks on Sumerian territory. Unlike the Gutians, who had been largely destructive raiders, the Elamites were a sophisticated people with their own urban civilization and military traditions. They were capable of mounting sustained campaigns and of governing conquered territories effectively. The final blow came in 2004 BC, when an Elamite army captured the city of Ur and carried off its last king, Ibbi-Sin, in chains, the site of a Sumerian king, descendant of Gilgamesh and heir to 3 millennia of civilization. Being led away as a prisoner marked the end of Sumerian political independence forever. The cultural impact of this defeat was profound. The Sumerians had survived the Akkadian conquest because the Akkadians had adopted and preserved much of Sumerian culture. They had vived the Gutian devastation because it had been temporary and destructive rather than permanently transformative. But the Elamite conquest was different. It marked the beginning of a new phase in Mesopotamian history, one in which Sumerian culture would survive only as a learned tradition rather than a living civilization. The great libraries of Ur were scattered, their tablets carried off to foreign lands or buried in the ruins of collapsed buildings. The schools that had trained generations of scribes were closed, their students dispersed to seek their fortunes in other cities. The temples that had maintained the ancient rituals for millennia found themselves without royal patronage, their priests struggling to maintain traditions that seemed increasingly irrelevant to the new political reality. As the last Sumerian king was led away in chains, the ancient language began its slow retreat into the realm of priests and scholars, while new peoples with new dreams gathered at the gates of the old world. The Sumerian Renaissance had been brief but brilliant, a final demonstration of the creative power of the civilization that had given the world its first cities, its first writing, and its first literature. The legacy of the third dynasty of Ur would outlive the political state that created it. The legal principles established in the Code of Ur-Nammu would influence lawgivers for centuries to come. The architectural achievements of the Great Ziggurat would inspire builders throughout the ancient world. The literary works preserved in the royal archives would continue to be copied and studied long after the language in which they were written had ceased to be spoken. The Sumerian swan song was ending, but its echoes would resonate through the ages, reminding future generations that the greatest human achievements often emerge not from conquest and domination, but from the patient cultivation of wisdom, beauty, and devotion to something greater than oneself. Along the banks of the Euphrates, where the river bends like a serpent seeking the sea, there stood a city that would give its name to greatness and become synonymous with both splendor and hubris. Babylon began as nothing more than a collection of mud brick houses clustered around a modest temple, one of countless settlements that dotted the fertile plain. Yet within these humble walls, destiny was stirring. The old order was crumbling. The Sumerian Renaissance that had briefly rekindled the glory of Ur was fading like the last embers of a dying fire. Into this vacuum stepped a new people, the Amorites, desert nomads who had been pressing against the borders of civilization for generations. They came not as destroyers, but as inheritors, adopting the ways of the cities they conquered, while bringing their own fierce vitality to the ancient land. In Babylon, an Amorite dynasty took root. The first kings were mere shadows, their names preserved only in the patient chronicles of scribes. But in the reign of Hammurabi, the sixth king of this humble line, the world would witness something unprecedented, the birth of a legal code that would echo through the corridors of history until the end of time. Hammurabi was not born to greatness. When he ascended the throne around 1792 BC, Babylon was merely one city among many in a fractured landscape of competing powers. To the north, the Assyrians pressed their claims. To the east, the Elamites raided with impunity. To the south, the ancient cities of Sumer still commanded respect, their kings ruling from thrones that had been ancient when the world was young. But Hammurabi possessed something his rivals lacked: patience married to ambition, and the wisdom to know when to bend and when to break. For the first decades of his reign, he played the careful diplomat, forging alliances with one hand while preparing for war with the other. And he understood that power, like a river, must sometimes flow around obstacles before it can wash them away. The god Marduk, patron deity of Babylon, was then but a minor figure in the crowded pantheon of Mesopotamian gods. Enlil still commanded the winds, Enki still governed the waters, and Inanna still danced in the heavens. But as Hammurabi's power grew, so too did the stature of his god. For in the ancient world, the strength of a deity was measured by the success of his chosen city. The conquest began slowly, methodically. Hammurabi's armies, equipped with the latest innovations in bronze weaponry and siegecraft, moved like a patient tide across the land. First fell the smaller cities, their walls crumbling before the disciplined assault of professional soldiers. Then came the great prizes: Larsa, the proud southern city that had claimed dominion over the old Sumerian lands, and Mari, the magnificent trading center that controlled the routes to the Mediterranean. With each victory, Hammurabi's vision grew clearer. He saw not merely the conquest of cities, but the creation of something new, a unified realm where law would replace the arbitrary whims of local kings, where justice would flow like water through irrigation channels, reaching every corner of the land. The old ways of blood feuds and tribal vengeance would give way to a system of rational jurisprudence that would endure for millennia. In the 32nd year of his reign, Hammurabi commissioned the greatest work of his life, a code of laws that would govern his expanding empire. Upon a black stone stele, nearly 8 feet tall, scribes carved 282 laws in the ancient cuneiform script. At the top, the king knelt before Shamash, the sun god, who was also the god of justice, receiving the rod and ring of divine authority. Below, the laws unfolded like a river of justice, covering every aspect of human life, from property rights to family relations, from commercial transactions to criminal punishment. If a man steals a sheep, he shall pay 10 sheep, read one law, establishing the principle of proportional punishment. If a man builds a house badly and it falls and kills the owner, the builder shall be put to death, read another, enshrining the responsibility of craftsmanship. If a man's wife is caught lying with another man, they shall both be thrown into the water, declared a third, reflecting the harsh morality of the age. But perhaps most revolutionary was the principle that underlay all the laws, that justice was not the privilege of the powerful, but the birthright of all. "I am the king who is preeminent among kings," Hammurabi declared in the prologue to his code, that the strong might not oppress the weak, that justice might be dealt to the orphan and the widow. As Babylon's empire expanded, so too did the influence of its god. Marduk began to appear in the pantheons of conquered cities, not as a conqueror, but as a divine king who had earned his place through victory in cosmic battle. The scribes of Babylon composed a new creation myth, the Enuma Elish, that told of how Marduk had defeated the primordial chaos monster Tiamat and created the world from her corpse. In this myth, the supremacy of Babylon was not merely political but cosmic, ordained by the gods themselves. The city that Hammurabi built was a marvel of urban planning. The great ziggurat of Marduk, called Etemenanki, house of the foundation of heaven and earth, rose in 7 terraced stages toward the sky, its peak crowned with a temple where the god was said to descend each night to sleep in his golden bed. The processional way, paved with glazed bricks and decorated with reliefs of lions and dragons, led from the Ishtar Gate to the heart of the city, where the king's palace stood guard over the dreams of empire. Under Hammurabi's rule, Babylon became the center of a cultural renaissance that would influence the ancient world for centuries to come. Mathematicians developed new systems of calculation that would eventually reach the Greeks and Romans. Astronomers mapped the movements of the planets with unprecedented accuracy, creating the foundation for all future stargazing. Merchants developed new forms of credit and banking that would revolutionize commerce from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. Yet even as Babylon reached its greatest height, the seeds of its decline were already sprouting. The empire that Hammurabi had built was held together by the force of his personality and the loyalty of his generals. When he died in 1750 BC, his son Samsu-Iluna inherited not just a throne, but a burden that would prove too great for mortal shoulders to bear. The subject cities began to rebel, one by one. The Sealand dynasty rose in the south, claiming the ancient legacy of Sumer. The Kassites pressed down from the northern mountains, their bronze weapons glinting in the sun. The Hittites, masters of the new iron technology, cast hungry eyes southward from their strongholds in Anatolia. The end came with shocking swiftness. In 1595 BC, just 150 years after Hammurabi's death, a Hittite army under King Mursili. I appeared before the walls of Babylon like a thunderbolt from the northern sky. The city that had seemed eternal fell in a single day, its treasures carted away to distant Hattusa, its dynasty extinguished like a candle in a hurricane. But even as Babylon burned, Hammurabi's true legacy endured. His laws, carved in stone and copied on countless tablets, would be studied and adapted by every subsequent civilization. The principle that law should be written down for all to see, that justice should be consistent and proportional, that the weak should be protected from the strong, these ideas would travel far beyond the borders of Mesopotamia, influencing the laws of the Hebrews, the Greeks, the Romans, and ultimately every legal system that followed. As the last flames died in the ruins of Hammurabi's palace, the black stone stele stood unmarked in the rubble, its laws still glowing in the darkness like stars in the night sky. The kings who had carved them were dust. The empire they had built was memory, but the words they had written would echo through eternity, reminding all who came after that true power lies not in the strength of armies, but in the justice of laws. In the aftermath of Babylon's fall, the ancient land between the rivers lay stunned and bloodied like a wounded giant struggling to rise. The Hittites, having struck their lightning blow, withdrew to their mountain strongholds, leaving behind a power vacuum that would be filled by one of history's most mysterious peoples, the Kassites. They came from the mountains of the east, these Kassites, speaking a language that bore no relation to any known tongue, worshipping gods whose names were strange even to the cosmopolitan priests of Babylon. Yet, what they lacked in cultural sophistication, they made up for in adaptability and patience. Where the Hittites had come as destroyers, the Kassites came as inheritors, ready to learn the ways of the civilization they had conquered. The Kassite conquest was unlike any that had come before. There were no great battles, no dramatic sieges, no royal proclamations of victory. Instead, there was a slow, inexorable settling, like silt carried by the spring floods. Kassite chieftains established themselves in the ruins of Babylonian cities, married into local families, adopted Mesopotamian customs, and gradually, almost imperceptibly, became the new masters of the ancient land. What followed was perhaps the most remarkable cultural transformation in ancient history. The Kassites, these mountain barbarians, did not impose their own ways upon their subjects. Instead, they became more Babylonian than the Babylonians themselves, zealous guardians of traditions that predated their arrival by 2 millennia. They restored the temples, rebuilt the ziggurats, and carefully preserved the ancient texts that contained the wisdom of ages. Kurigalzu I, the first great Kassite king, established his new capital at Dur-Kurigalzu, fortress of Kurigalzu, but he also lavished attention on ancient Babylon, rebuilding Marduk's temple and ensuring that the traditional rituals continued unchanged. The Kassites understood, perhaps better than any conquerors before them, that legitimacy in Mesopotamia came not from force of arms, but from the approval of the gods. The Kassite period, stretching across 4 centuries, was an age of consolidation rather than innovation. The great creative explosion that had characterized earlier Mesopotamian civilizations gave way to a more conservative approach, focused on preserving and systematizing the accumulated wisdom of the past. This was the age when the great literary works of Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Enuma Elish, the hymns to Inanna, were collected, edited, and preserved in their canonical forms. Perhaps the most significant Kassite contribution to Mesopotamian civilization was their mastery of horses. These mountain people had learned the art of horse training from the Hurrians and Mitannians, and they brought this knowledge to the river valleys of Mesopotamia. The horse, previously known only as a curiosity, became an instrument of war and a symbol of royal power. Kassite kings rode to battle in horse-drawn chariots, their bronze wheels thundering across the ancient plains. The Kassites also introduced new architectural styles, blending mountain traditions with Mesopotamian techniques. Their temples were massive, solid structures that spoke of permanence and endurance. The ziggurat of Agar Kuf, built by Kurigalzu I, still stands today, its mud brick core having survived earthquakes, floods, and the passage of 4 millennia. But the Kassite period was also marked by the rise of great powers beyond Mesopotamia's borders. To the west, Egypt had recovered from the chaos of the Second Intermediate Period and was flexing its muscles under the warrior pharaohs of the New Kingdom. To the north, the Hittites had established a mighty empire that stretched from the Aegean to the upper Euphrates. To the east, the Elamites were stirring once again, their eyes fixed on the rich prize of Babylon. This was the age of the first international diplomacy, when kings corresponded with one another as equals, arranged marriages between their children, and sent embassies laden with gifts across vast distances. The Amarna letters, discovered in Egypt, reveal a world where the Kassite king of Babylon was recognized as one of the great powers of the ancient world, his friendship courted by pharaohs and Hittite kings alike. To Kadashman-Enlil, king of Babylon, my brother, wrote Amenhotep III of Egypt, "Thus says the king of Egypt, your brother, I am well, my household is well, my horses are well, my chariots are well, and in my land all is well. May you be well, may your household be well, may your horses be well, may your chariots be well, and may your land be well." This diplomatic revolution reflected deeper changes in the ancient world. The old isolationism of the early city-states had given way to a recognition that the world was becoming smaller, that the fates of distant kingdoms were increasingly intertwined. Trade routes now spanned continents, carrying not just goods but ideas, technologies, and cultural influences. The Kassites proved adept at this new international game. They maintained diplomatic relations with Egypt, exchanged gifts with the Hittites, and played a careful balance between the various powers that surrounded them. Their kings spoke of being beloved of Marduk, but also acknowledged the power of foreign deities, reflecting the cosmopolitan nature of their age. Yet beneath this apparent stability, currents of change were flowing. The old Bronze Age world was giving way to a new Iron Age reality. The Hittites had mastered the secrets of iron smelting, giving them weapons that could cut through bronze armor like paper. The Sea Peoples were beginning to stir in the eastern Mediterranean, their movements presaging the collapse of the Great Bronze Age civilizations. The Kassites, for all their adaptability, were increasingly seen as custodians of the past rather than architects of the future. Their long reign had brought stability to Mesopotamia, but it had also led to a certain stagnation. The great innovations that had characterized earlier periods, the invention of writing, the development of mathematics and astronomy, the creation of literary masterpieces, had given way to careful preservation and gradual refinement. As the second millennium BC drew to a close, new powers were rising on the periphery of the Mesopotamian world. To the north, the Assyrians were transforming themselves from merchant princes into warriors, their armies equipped with iron weapons and driven by an imperial ambition that would soon reshape the ancient world. To the south, the Chaldeans were settling in the marshlands of the Persian Gulf, bringing with them new ideas about astronomy and mathematics that would eventually revolutionize human understanding of the cosmos. The end of the Kassite period came not with a bang, but with a whimper. In 1155 BC, the Elamite king Shutruk-Nahunta invaded Babylon, capturing the last Kassite king and carrying away the sacred statue of Marduk. The dynasty that had ruled for over 4 centuries simply faded away, leaving behind only their massive temples and the memory of a people who had learned to rule by serving the traditions they had inherited. As the Elamites withdrew to their mountain fastnesses, taking with them the symbols of Mesopotamian power, the ancient land entered a new period of uncertainty. The stable world of the Bronze Age was crumbling, and in its place would rise new powers with new ambitions. The Kassites had been the last rulers to govern Mesopotamia in the old way, respecting the ancient traditions while adapting to changing circumstances. What would come next would be something entirely different. The age of iron and empire, when the art of war would be perfected and the dream of universal dominion would seize the imagination of kings. The foreign centuries were ending, but their legacy would endure. The Kassites had preserved the treasures of Mesopotamian civilization through 400 years of change, ensuring that the wisdom of the past would survive to inspire future generations. They had also shown that cultural identity could transcend ethnic boundaries, that a people could become fully part of a civilization, not by destroying it, but by embracing it completely. In the hills of northern Mesopotamia, where the Tigris curves between rocky outcrops and the air carries the scent of cedar and iron, a transformation was taking place that would reshape the ancient world. The Assyrians, who had once been content to trade along the caravan routes and worship their god Ashur in quiet temples, were forging themselves into an instrument of conquest that would make the very name of their capital synonymous with terror. The change began slowly, almost imperceptibly. In the 14th century BC, as the great powers of the Bronze Age played their diplomatic games, Assyria was little more than a collection of city-states struggling to maintain their independence. The Mitannians pressed from the west, the Babylonians from the south, the Hittites from the northwest. Assyria seemed destined to remain a minor player in the great game of nations, forever caught between mightier neighbors. But in the northern hills, something was stirring. The Assyrians had always been a warrior people, hardened by centuries of defending their mountain passes against raiders and invaders. They had learned to fight not just with courage but with cunning, not just with bronze, but with the new metal that was transforming warfare: iron. When the great Bronze Age kingdoms began to falter, the Assyrians were ready to step into the vacuum with weapons that could cut through the finest bronze armor like cloth. The first hint of what was to come appeared in the reign of Tiglath-Pileser I, who ruled from 1114 to 1076 BC. This king, whose name meant, "My trust is in the son of Ashara," embarked on campaigns that carried Assyrian arms farther than they had ever gone before. His armies marched to the Mediterranean, where he washed his weapons in the sea and received tribute from the Phoenician cities. They pushed into the Armenian highlands, where they hunted wild bulls and lions. They struck south into Babylonia, where they briefly held the ancient city of Babylon itself. But Tiglath-Pileser's empire was built on personal charisma and military genius. When he died, his conquests crumbled like sand castles before the tide. The Arameans, nomadic tribes from the Syrian desert, swept across the ancient lands, reducing the great cities to isolated islands in a sea of tribal warfare. For 2 centuries, Assyria retreated into itself, licking its wounds and preparing for the storm that was to come. The true Assyrian revolution began in the 9th century BC, when a new dynasty seized power in Nineveh and began the systematic transformation of their kingdom into a war machine without parallel in the ancient world. These kings understood that conquest was not enough. What was needed was a complete reimagining of how empire could function. The Assyrian military revolution was built on 3 pillars: iron weapons, professional soldiers, and systematic terror. The Assyrians were among the first to fully exploit the potential of iron, creating weapons that were not only harder than bronze, but also cheaper to produce. This meant that they could equip larger armies with superior weapons, giving them a decisive advantage over their Bronze Age enemies. But iron alone was not enough. The Assyrians also created the world's first truly professional army, with specialized units trained for specific tasks. Their infantry carried iron-tipped spears and shields. Their archers used composite bows that could penetrate armor at great distances, and their cavalry, initially mounted on horses, later on camels for desert warfare, provided mobility and shock power. Most innovative of all were their siege engines. The Assyrians perfected the art of taking fortified cities, developing battering rams, siege towers, and tunneling techniques that made even the strongest walls vulnerable. They also created the world's first organized intelligence service, with spies and informants throughout the known world feeding information back to the royal court. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of Assyrian warfare was their systematic use of psychological terror. They understood that the fear of conquest could be as effective as conquest itself, and they cultivated a reputation for brutality that preceded their armies like a plague. Cities that resisted were not merely conquered, but obliterated, their populations enslaved, their leaders flayed alive, their walls torn down stone by stone. The Assyrian kings gloried in their cruelty, recording their atrocities in loving detail on the walls of their palaces. "I flayed many of the nobles who had rebelled against me," wrote Shalmaneser III, "and spread their skins on the walls. I cut off the hands of some, the feet of others. I cut off the noses and ears of many." These were not the boasts of barbarian raiders, but the calculated policies of sophisticated administrators who understood that terror could be a tool of statecraft. The systematic nature of Assyrian brutality was matched by the systematic nature of their administration. Conquered territories were not left to their own devices, but were integrated into a vast bureaucratic machine that extracted tribute, manpower, and resources with ruthless efficiency. The Assyrians pioneered the use of mass deportation, moving entire populations across their empire to prevent rebellion and create a homogenized imperial culture. Under Tiglath-Pileser III, who ruled from 744 to 727 BC, the Assyrian Empire reached its mature form. This king, who took his name from the ancient conqueror, completed the transformation of Assyria from a regional power into a world empire. His armies conquered Damascus, reducing the proud Aramean kingdoms to Assyrian provinces. They invaded Israel, carrying away the 10 northern tribes in a deportation so complete that they vanished from history forever. The conquest of Israel marked a turning point in world history. For the first time, the Assyrians came into direct contact with the Hebrew people, whose fierce monotheism and prophetic tradition would profoundly influence the development of human thought. The Hebrew prophets, witnessing the destruction of their nation, interpreted the Assyrian conquest in theological terms, seeing in it the judgment of their God upon a sinful people. "The Assyrian is the rod of my anger," declared the prophet Isaiah, "and the staff in his hand is my fury." This theological interpretation of imperial conquest would have profound consequences for the development of monotheistic religion, establishing a pattern of understanding historical events in terms of divine judgment that would influence Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The reign of Sargon II, from 722 to 705 BC, saw the Assyrian Empire reach its greatest extent. This king, who took the name of the ancient Akkadian conqueror, completed the conquest of Israel and pushed Assyrian power into regions that had never before known foreign domination. His armies marched into the highlands of Urartu, where they captured the capital of Tushpa and carried away vast amounts of treasure. They invaded Cyprus, making that island kingdom an Assyrian vassal. They even pushed into the Arabian Peninsula, extracting tribute from the nomadic tribes of the desert. But it was Sargon's son, Sennacherib, who became the most famous of all Assyrian kings, largely because of his dramatic encounter with the kingdom of Judah. In 701 BC, Sennacherib's armies surrounded Jerusalem, demanding the surrender of King Hezekiah. The The siege was recorded not only in Assyrian annals, but also in the Hebrew Bible, creating one of the most dramatic confrontations in ancient history. The Assyrian king was confident of victory. His armies had conquered every other city in Judah, and Jerusalem seemed doomed to share their fate. But something unprecedented happened. The city held out, and after a siege of several months, the Assyrian army withdrew. The Hebrew Bible records that an angel of the Lord killed 185,000 Assyrian soldiers in a single night, while Assyrian records speak vaguely of receiving tribute and withdrawing. Whatever the truth of what happened at Jerusalem, the event marked the beginning of the end for Assyrian power. The kingdom of Judah had shown that the Assyrian war machine was not invincible, and across the empire, subject peoples began to stir with new hope. Sennacherib's son, Esarhaddon, achieved the greatest triumph in Assyrian history when he conquered Egypt in 671 BC. For the first time, a single empire controlled the entire Fertile Crescent, from the Persian Gulf to the Nile Delta. The pharaohs who had ruled Egypt for 3,000 years were reduced to Assyrian vassals. The ancient gods of Egypt were carried away to Assyrian temples, and Egyptian gold flowed north to fill the treasuries of Nineveh. But the conquest of Egypt proved to be the high-water mark of Assyrian power. The vast empire was becoming impossible to govern, with rebellions breaking out faster than they could be suppressed. The Assyrian army, for all its professional excellence, was simply not large enough to garrison such an enormous territory while continuing to expand. The final great Assyrian king was Ashurbanipal, who ruled from 668 to 627 BC. This remarkable monarch was both a warrior and a scholar, a man who could personally lead his armies into battle and then return to his palace to study the ancient texts he had collected from across his empire. Under his patronage, the Royal Library of Nineveh became the greatest repository of knowledge in the ancient world, containing over 30,000 tablets covering every aspect of Mesopotamian civilization. It was in this library that the modern world would eventually rediscover the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Enuma Elish, and countless other literary treasures of the ancient world. Ashurbanipal's scholars compiled the first comprehensive encyclopedia of human knowledge, preserving for posterity the accumulated wisdom of 3 millennia of Mesopotamian civilization. But even as Ashurbanipal was building his library, the foundations of his empire were crumbling. The king became increasingly preoccupied with astrological omens and religious rituals, while his generals struggled to maintain control over restless provinces. Civil war broke out between Ashurbanipal and his brother, who ruled Babylon as a vassal king. The conflict weakened both sides and provided an opportunity for Assyria's enemies to strike. The end came with shocking swiftness. In 627 BC, Ashurbanipal died, and the empire immediately began to fragment. The Babylonians, led by Nabopolassar, rose in rebellion. The Medes, an Iranian people who had been building their own empire in the east, allied themselves with the Babylonians. Together, they struck at the heart of Assyrian power. In 612 BC, the allied armies of Babylonians and Medes appeared before the walls of Nineveh. The city that had been the terror of the ancient world for 3 centuries fell after a siege of just 3 months. The palace of Ashurbanipal was burned, his library scattered, his treasures looted. The Assyrian Empire, which had seemed destined to rule the world forever, vanished like smoke in the wind. The fall of Nineveh was greeted with rejoicing throughout the ancient world. The Hebrew prophet Nahum expressed the feelings of all who had suffered under Assyrian domination. Woe to the bloody city! It is all full of lies and robbery, the noise of a whip, and the noise of the rattling of wheels, and of the prancing horses, and of the jumping chariots. There is a multitude of slain, and indeed a great number of carcasses, and there is no end of their corpses. The Assyrian Empire had lasted for 3 centuries and had created the template for all subsequent imperial enterprises. They had shown that it was possible to rule diverse peoples across vast distances, that professional armies could triumph over tribal militias. that terror could be as effective as diplomacy in maintaining control. But they had also demonstrated the ultimate futility of ruling through fear alone. The iron wolves of Assyria had devoured themselves in the end, their appetite for conquest proving greater than their ability to digest what they had consumed. They left behind empty palaces and silent cities, but also a library full of treasures and a legacy of administrative techniques that would influence every empire that followed. In seeking to conquer the world, they had preserved it for future generations, ensuring that the voices of the ancient past would not be lost to the silence of eternity. The famous story of his madness, when he was said to have lived like a beast in the fields for 7 years, may reflect the ancient world's understanding that absolute power could corrupt even the greatest minds. But beyond the biblical accounts, Nebuchadnezzar's own inscriptions reveal a king obsessed with building and beautification. He restored temples throughout his empire, rebuilt the ancient cities of Ur and Uruk, and created a network of canals and roads that facilitated trade and communication across his vast domains. His engineers perfected the science of hydraulics, creating irrigation systems that transformed the desert into gardens and aqueducts that brought fresh water to the hearts of great cities. The Babylonian Empire under Nebuchadnezzar also witnessed a remarkable flowering of learning and culture. The Chaldean astronomers, building on millennia of Mesopotamian stargazing, developed mathematical techniques for predicting celestial events with unprecedented accuracy. They created the zodiac, divided the year into 12 months, and established the 7-day week. Their mathematical astronomy would eventually influence the Greeks, and through them, the entire development of Western science. The palace schools of Babylon became centers of learning that attracted scholars from across the ancient world. Here, the old Sumerian and Akkadian texts were studied and copied, ensuring their preservation for future generations. New works were composed in the classical style, including religious hymns, wisdom literature, and scientific treatises. The scribal schools developed new techniques for training students, creating standardized curricula that would influence education for centuries to come. But even as Babylon reached its cultural zenith, the seeds of its decline were already being sown. The empire that Nebuchadnezzar had built was held together by his Perso, null authority and the loyalty of his generals. When he died in 562 BC, the succession crisis that followed revealed the fundamental weaknesses of the Babylonian system. Nebuchadnezzar's son, Marduk, was murdered after just 2 years on the throne. His successor, Neriglissar, managed to rule for 4 years before dying in battle. The throne then passed to Nabonidus, an elderly nobleman who had served as a general under Nebuchadnezzar, but whose reign would prove to be the last chapter in the long story of Mesopotamian independence. Nabonidus was a scholar king, an antiquarian who was more interested in archaeology than administration. He spent years restoring ancient temples and studying old inscriptions, claiming to have discovered foundation stones laid by kings who had ruled 2,000 years before his time. His inscriptions read like the work of a modern archaeologist, carefully noting the names of ancient rulers and describing the techniques used in their construction projects. But Nabonidus's scholarly interests proved to be a political liability. He moved the royal court to the oasis city of Tema in the Arabian desert, leaving his son Belshazzar to rule Babylon as regent. This absence from the traditional center of power was seen by many as an abandonment of royal duty, while his religious reforms, including the elevation of the moon god Sin at the expense of Marduk, alienated the powerful priesthood of Babylon. Meanwhile, a new power was rising in the east that would transform the ancient world once again. Cyrus the Great, king of the Persians, had united the Iranian tribes under his rule and was building an empire that would eventually stretch from India to Greece. In 550 BC, he conquered the Medes, his former overlords. In 546 BC, he defeated Croesus of Lydia, the richest king in the ancient world. By 540 BC, his armies were approaching the borders of the Babylonian Empire. The final confrontation came in 539 BC when Cyrus's forces met the Babylonian army at Opis on the Tigris. The battle was a rout, with the Babylonians fleeing in panic before the disciplined Persian infantry. Within days, Cyrus's general Gobryas had reached the walls of Babylon itself. What happened next was unprecedented in the annals of ancient warfare. The great city of Babylon, which had withstood sieges by Assyrians, Elamites, and countless other enemies, opened its gates without a fight. The Persian army marched in peacefully, while the population lined the streets to welcome their new master. Cyrus himself entered the city like a liberator rather than a conqueror, going immediately to the temple of Marduk to receive the blessing of the ancient god. The ease of the Persian conquest reflected the profound changes that had taken place in the ancient world. The old system of city-states and territorial kingdoms was giving way to a new form of empire based on administrative efficiency and religious tolerance rather than military terror. The Persians understood that lasting rule required the consent of the governed, and they were prepared to respect local customs and traditions in exchange for political submission. The famous Cyrus cylinder, discovered in the ruins of Babylon, records the Persian king's promise to restore the temples of all gods, to return exiled peoples to their homelands, and to rule according to the principles of justice and mercy. This document, sometimes called the First Charter of Human Rights, marked the beginning of a new chapter in the history of empire. For the Jews of Babylon, Cyrus's conquest was nothing short of miraculous. The king who had destroyed their enemies and liberated them from exile was hailed as a Messiah, an anointed one sent by God to restore his people. The biblical books of Ezra and Nehemiah tell the story of the return to, O Jerusalem, and the rebuilding of the temple, fulfilling the prophecies of Isaiah and Jeremiah. But for the Babylonians themselves, the Persian conquest marked the end of an era. The city that had been the center of world civilization for over a millennium was now merely a provincial capital in a vast empire ruled from distant Persepolis. The ancient gods still received their offerings, the old festivals were still celebrated, but the creative energy that had made Babylon great had passed to other lands. As the last sunset of Babylonian independence faded over the ziggurats and gardens of Nebuchadnezzar's city, the ancient world was transformed forever. The age of the city-state was ending, giving way to the age of the universal empire. The dreams of local kings were being replaced by the visions of world rulers who saw themselves as the agents of cosmic order. Yet even as political power shifted to new centers, the cultural legacy of Babylon endured. The astronomical knowledge of the Chaldeans, the legal traditions of Hammurabi, the literary achievements of the Sumerian and Akkadian scribes, all these treasures were preserved and transmitted to future generations. The Persian conquerors, unlike their Assyrian predecessors, understood that the greatest treasures of the conquered lands were not gold and silver, but knowledge and wisdom. The Indian summer of Babylon was over, but its fruits would nourish human civilization for millennia to come. In the schools of Athens, students would study Babylonian mathematics. In the libraries of Alexandria, scholars would copy Mesopotamian texts. In the courts of Baghdad, astronomers would use techniques first developed in the palace schools of Nebuchadnezzar. The wonder of Babylon lived on, not in its ruins, but in its ideas, not in its walls, but in its words, not in its power, but in its dreams of what humanity could achieve when it dared to reach toward heaven. The morning of October 12th, 539 BC, dawned like any other over the ancient city of Babylon, but before the sun had set, 3,000 years of Mesopotamian independence would come to an end. The conquest that transformed the ancient world was accomplished not with the clash of bronze on bronze or the thunder of war chariots, but with the opening of gates and the silence of submission. For the first time in its long history, the cradle of civilization would bow to a foreign master who came not as a destroyer, but as a liberator. Cyrus the Great, king of the Persians and Medes, stood at the threshold of Babylon as the culmination of a career that had already transformed the ancient world. Born into the ruling family of Anshan, a small kingdom in the Iranian highlands, he had spent 20 years forging the fractious tribes of the plateau into a disciplined imperial army. His conquests had been methodical and inexorable. First the Medes, his former overlords, then the Lydians with their legendary wealth, then the Greek cities of Ionia with their revolutionary ideas about government and philosophy. But Babylon was different. This was not merely another kingdom to be added to his growing empire, but the very heart of ancient civilization, the city where writing had been perfected, where law had been codified, where the first great works of literature had been composed. The temples of Babylon contained the accumulated wisdom of 3 millennia, while its walls enclosed treasures that had been gathered from across the known world. Cyrus understood that Babylon could not be conquered in the traditional sense. Its walls were too strong, its defenders too proud, its symbolic importance too great. A siege would unite the population against him, while a sack would destroy the very treasures he sought to inherit. Instead, he chose a different path. He would become not the conqueror or Babylon, but its liberator, not the destroyer of its traditions, but their guardian. The Persian approach to empire was revolutionary. Where the Assyrians had ruled through terror and the Babylonians through magnificence, the Persians governed through a combination of administrative efficiency and religious tolerance that was unprecedented in the ancient world. They understood that lasting rule required not just the submission of bodies, but the consent of souls, and they were prepared to respect local customs and traditions in exchange for political loyalty. The conquest of Babylon began not with an assault on its walls, but with a campaign for its hearts and minds. Persian agents circulated throughout the city, spreading the word that Cyrus came not as an enemy, but as a friend, that he respected the ancient gods and would restore their temples, that he would free the exiled peoples and return them to their homelands. The message was carefully crafted to appeal to different groups within the city. To the priests, the promise of religious freedom; to the merchants, the prospect of expanded trade; to the exiled peoples, the hope of return. The effectiveness of this propaganda campaign was revealed when Cyrus's army finally approached the city walls. The battle at Opis had already demonstrated the superiority of Persian arms, but it was the response of the Babylonians themselves that sealed their fate. The gates of the great city opened without a fight, and the Persian army marched in to the cheers of crowds who welcomed them as deliverers rather than conquerors. The scene that followed was unlike anything in the annals of ancient warfare. Instead of the usual pillage and destruction that accompanied the fall of a great city, there was an orderly transition of power that respected the dignity of both conquerors and conquered. Cyrus himself entered Babylon not in a war riot but on foot, proceeding directly to the temple of Marduk to receive the blessing of the ancient god and to proclaim himself not as a foreign invader, but as the chosen king of Babylon. The famous Cyrus cylinder, commissioned to commemorate the conquest, presents the Persian king's own version of events. Written in the traditional style of Mesopotamian royal inscriptions, it portrays Cyrus as the chosen instrument of Marduk, sent to restore justice to a land that had been misgoverned by the impious Nabonidus. The cylinder proclaims Cyrus's intention to restore the temples of all gods, to return exiled peoples to their homelands, and to rule according to the ancient principles of justice and mercy. I am Cyrus, king of the world, great king, mighty king, king of Babylon, king of the land of Sumer and Akkad, king of the 4 quarters of the world, the inscription declares. When I entered Babylon peacefully, amid joy and jubilation, I took up my lordly residence in the royal palace. Marduk, the great lord, established as his fate for me a magnanimous heart of one who loves Babylon, and I daily attended to his worship. The cylinder goes on to describe Cyrus's program of restoration and reform. I returned to the sacred cities on the other side of the Tigris, whose sanctuaries had been ruins for a long time, the images which used to live therein and established for them permanent sanctuaries. I also gathered all their former inhabitants and returned to them their habitations. For the Jewish exiles in Babylon, Cyrus's conquest was nothing short of miraculous. The king who had defeated their oppressors and promised to restore them to their homeland was hailed as a Messiah, an anointed one sent by God to fulfill the ancient prophecies. The biblical books of Ezra and Nehemiah tell the story of the return to Jerusalem and the rebuilding of the temple, while the prophet Isaiah proclaims Cyrus as the Lord's anointed. Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have grasped, to subdue nations before him, the return of the Jews to Jerusalem. Was part of a broader Persian policy of restoring displaced peoples to their ancestral homes. Unlike the Assyrians, who had used mass deportation as a tool of imperial control, the Persians understood that satisfied subjects were more valuable than resentful exiles. The restoration of the Jewish community in Palestine created a buffer state between the Persian Empire and Egypt, while the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem provided a focal point for Jewish loyalty to the Persian crown. But the Persian conquest of Babylon was significant not just for what it restored, but for what it ended. The city that had been the center of world civilization for over a millennium was now merely a provincial capital in a vast empire that stretched from India to Greece. The ancient gods still received their offerings, the old festivals were still celebrated, but the creative energy that had made Babylon great had passed to other lands. The transformation was gradual but inexorable. The Persian administrative system, with its emphasis on efficiency and standardization, gradually replaced the traditional Mesopotamian methods of government. The old priestly bureaucracy, which had maintained detailed records in cuneiform for 3 millennia, gave way to Persian scribes who wrote in Aramaic, the international language of the new empire. The ancient Akkadian language, which had been the lingua franca of the ancient world, slowly retreated into the realm of religious ritual and scholarly study. Yet the Persian conquest was not simply a matter of cultural replacement. The Persians were remarkably tolerant of local traditions and customs, understanding that the strength of their empire lay not in uniformity but in diversity. They allowed the Babylonian priests to continue their ancient rituals, the merchants to maintain their traditional trade networks, and the scholars to preserve their accumulated wisdom. The great libraries of Babylon continued to function, though they were now part of an imperial system that valued practical administration over speculative learning. The reign of Cyrus marked the beginning of a new era in human history, the age of the universal empire. For the first time, a single ruler claimed dominion over the entire civilized world, from the Aegean Sea to the Indus River. This was not merely a matter of territorial expansion, but of conceptual revolution. The old world of competing city-states and regional kingdoms was giving way to a new vision of empire as a cosmic institution, ordained by the gods to bring order and justice to all humanity. The Persian Empire would prove to be the most successful and longest-lasting of all the ancient empires, enduring for over 2 centuries and providing a model for imperial administration that would influence the Greeks, Romans, and all subsequent empire builders. Its success lay not in military might alone, but in its ability to accommodate diversity while maintaining unity, to respect local traditions while imposing imperial order. As the sun set on October 12, 539 BC, the ancient world had been transformed forever. The independent kingdoms of Mesopotamia had become provinces of a world empire, their rulers reduced to satraps and their gods enrolled in a cosmopolitan pantheon. The rivers that had witnessed the birth of civilization now flowed through foreign lands, carrying their waters toward distant seas under alien stars. Yet even as political independence ended, the cultural legacy of Mesopotamia lived on. The wisdom of the ancients, preserved in countless tablets and inscriptions, would continue to influence human thought for millennia to come. The laws of Hammurabi, the epics of Gilgamesh, the astronomical observations of the Chaldeans, All these treasures of human achievement would survive the fall of empires and the passage of ages, testifying to the enduring power of ideas over the transient glory of political power. The peaceful conquest of Babylon marked not just the end of Mesopotamian independence, but the beginning of a new chapter in human history. The age of the city-state was ending, giving way to the age of the universal empire. The dreams of local kings were being replaced by the visions of world rulers who saw themselves as the agents of cosmic order. And in the heart of this transformation, the ancient city of Babylon stood as a bridge between the old world and the new, its walls and temples bearing witness to the eternal human quest for meaning and permanence in a world of constant change. The conquest of Babylon by Cyrus the Great marked not the end of Mesopotamian civilization, but the beginning of its long, slow transformation into something unrecognizable, like a great river that continues to flow even as its banks are reshaped by new currents. The ancient culture of the land between the rivers would persist for another 1,000 years, adapting and evolving under a succession of foreign masters while gradually losing its distinct identity. Under Persian rule, Mesopotamia became the satrap of Babylonia, one of the wealthiest and most important provinces in the vast Achaemenid Empire. The Persians, true to their promise of religious tolerance, allowed the ancient temples to continue functioning and even provided funds for their restoration. The great festivals of Marduk and Ishtar continued to be celebrated with traditional pomp, while the priestly schools maintained their ancient curriculum of mathematics, astronomy, and divination. Darius the Great, who consolidated the Persian Empire after Cyrus's death, made Babylon one of his royal residences, building a magnificent palace that rivaled those of Persepolis and Susa. The city remained an important center of trade and learning, its position on the Euphrates making it a natural hub for commerce between the Iranian plateau and the Mediterranean world. Caravans from India and Central Asia still converged on its markets, while scholars from across the empire came to study in its libraries. Yet beneath this surface continuity, profound changes were taking place. The Persian administrative system, with its emphasis on efficiency and standardization, gradually replaced the traditional Mesopotamian methods of government. The old cuneiform bureaucracy, which had maintained detailed records for 3 millennia, gave way to Aramaic scribes who wrote on parchment and papyrus rather than clay. The ancient Akkadian language, which had been the lingua franca of the ancient world, slowly retreated into the realm of religious ritual and scholarly study. The Persian period saw the last great flowering of Mesopotamian astronomy. The Chaldean astronomers, building on centuries of accumulated observations, developed mathematical techniques for predicting celestial events that would not be surpassed until the scientific revolution of the early modern period. They created the first accurate calendar, developed trigonometry, and laid the foundations for all future astronomical work. Their observations and calculations were so precise that they could predict eclipses centuries in advance, earning them a reputation for supernatural wisdom that spread throughout the ancient world. This astronomical tradition represented the final great achievement of Mesopotamian civilization. While the political power of the region had passed to foreign rulers, its scholars continued to push the boundaries of human knowledge. The astronomical diaries kept by the Chaldean priests, with their meticulous records of celestial phenomena, would eventually provide crucial data for modern historians seeking to establish precise chronologies for ancient events. The Persian period also witnessed the gradual decline of the ancient religious traditions. While the great temples continued to function, they were increasingly isolated from the broader cultural life of the empire. The old myths and legends, which had once provided a common framework for understanding the world, gave way to new ideas flowing in from Iran, Greece, and other parts of the expanding Persian realm. The ancient gods, once the undisputed masters of the cosmic order, found themselves competing with new deities and new philosophies. The transformation of Mesopotamia accelerated dramatically in 331 BC, when Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire and brought Greek culture to the ancient lands of the East. the young Macedonian conqueror entered Babylon in triumph, planning to make it the capital of his world empire. He ordered the restoration of the great ziggurat of Marduk and promised to revive the ancient glories of the city. But Alexander's death in Babylon in 323 BC marked the end of this dream and the beginning of a new era of foreign rule. The Hellenistic period that followed Alexander's conquests brought profound changes to Mesopotamian civilization. The Seleucid Empire, established by one of Alexander's generals, made Mesopotamia a centerpiece of their realm, but they also introduced Greek culture and institutions that gradually displaced the ancient traditions. The new capital of Seleucia on Tigris, built near the site of ancient Babylon, became a center of Greek learning and culture, while the old city slowly declined in importance. The Seleucid rulers, like the Persians before them, initially showed respect for local traditions and customs. They patronized the ancient temples, participated in traditional festivals, and even adopted some Mesopotamian royal titles. But they also brought with them Greek ideas about government, philosophy, and religion that proved increasingly attractive to the educated classes of Mesopotamia. The Greek gymnasium, with its emphasis on physical education and intellectual development, became a new center of learning that competed with the traditional temple schools. Greek philosophy, with its rational approach to understanding the world, challenged the ancient mythological explanations of natural phenomena. Greek art and architecture, with their emphasis on human beauty and proportion, began to influence the traditional Mesopotamian styles. Perhaps significantly, the Greek alphabet began to replace cuneiform as the standard writing system for official documents and scholarly works. The ancient script, which had been used for over 3 millennia to record the thoughts and deeds of countless generations, slowly gave way to the more efficient alphabetic system that the Greeks had inherited from the Phoenicians. The Parthian conquest of Mesopotamia in 141 BC marked another turning point in the region's history. The Parthians, Iranian nomads who had originally been subjects of the Seleucid Empire, brought with them a different approach to governance that was more decentralized and tolerant of local traditions. They established their capital at Ctesiphon, across the Tigris from Seleucia, creating a new center of power that would dominate Mesopotamia for the next 4 centuries. Under Parthian rule, Mesopotamia experienced a cultural renaissance that saw the revival of some ancient traditions alongside the continued influence of Greek and Iranian elements. The Parthians, who were themselves of Iranian origin, showed particular respect for the ancient Persian traditions that had been preserved in the region. They also proved tolerant of the growing Christian communities that were beginning to establish themselves in the major cities. The rise of Christianity in Mesopotamia was one of the most significant developments of the Parthian period. The new religion, with its emphasis on monotheism and universal salvation, appealed to many who were dissatisfied with the traditional polytheistic systems. Christian communities flourished in cities like Edessa and Nisibis, while missionary activity spread the new faith throughout the region. The Sassanid conquest of Mesopotamia in AD 224 brought the final period of ancient rule to the region. The Sassanids, who claimed to be the heirs of the ancient Persian Achaemenids, attempted to restore the glories of the pre-Islamic past while adapting to the realities of a changed world. They made Ctesiphon their capital, transforming it into one of the greatest cities of the ancient world. Under Sassanid rule, Mesopotamia experienced its final period of prosperity under indigenous rule. The Sassanid kings patronized learning and the arts, built magnificent palaces and temples, and maintained extensive trade networks that connected the region to India, Central Asia, and the Mediterranean world. The famous Tak Khasra, the great vaulted hall of the Sassanid palace at Ctesiphon, still stands today as a testament to the architectural achievements of this period. Yet even as the Sassanids sought to revive the ancient glories, the fundamental character of Mesopotamian civilization was changing. The old cuneiform script had virtually disappeared, surviving only in the most conservative religious contexts. The ancient languages of Sumerian and Akkadian were no longer spoken, existing only as liturgical languages in temple rituals. The traditional pantheon of gods had been largely replaced by new religious systems, Christianity, Manichaeism, and various forms of Iranian religion. The ancient traditions persisted longest in the rural areas, where farmers still celebrated the seasonal festivals and told the old stories around their fires. In the marshlands of the south, communities maintained practices that could be traced back to the earliest periods of Mesopotamian civilization. But these were isolated survivals, cut off from the mainstream of cultural development. The Arab conquest of Mesopotamia in AD 637 marked the final transformation of the ancient land. The new Muslim rulers, unlike their predecessors, brought with them not just a new political system, but a new religion and a new language that would completely reshape the cultural landscape of the region. The ancient temples were abandoned or converted to mosques, while the Arabic language replaced the various local languages as the medium of government and learning. The last cuneiform tablet was written sometime in the 1st century AD, marking the end of the world's oldest writing system. The final temple to the ancient gods was probably abandoned in the 6th century, bringing to a close religious traditions that had persisted for over 4 millennia. The ancient names of cities and rivers were gradually replaced by Arabic equivalents, while the old stories and legends faded from memory. Yet even as the visible traces of ancient Mesopotamian civilization disappeared, its invisible legacy lived on. The legal traditions established by Hammurabi influenced the development of Islamic law. The astronomical observations of the Chaldeans provided the foundation for medieval Islamic astronomy. The literary traditions of the ancient epics found new expression in Arabic poetry and prose. The irrigation systems developed by the ancient Mesopotamians continued to function, supporting the agricultural prosperity of the region under its new rulers. The urban traditions of the ancient cities influenced the development of Baghdad, which became one of the greatest centers of learning in the medieval world. The commercial networks established by ancient merchants provided the foundation for the extensive trade that connected the medieval Islamic world. In the end, Mesopotamian civilization did not die but transformed, its essential elements absorbed into new cultural syntheses that would influence the development of human civilization for centuries to come. The ancient gods fell silent, but their temples had preserved the knowledge that would fuel the scientific revolution. The old kings were forgotten, but their laws had established principles of justice that would echo through the ages. The ancient languages disappeared, but their literature had captured universal truths about the human condition that would inspire writers and thinkers for millennia. As the last echoes of the ancient world faded into silence, the rivers continued to flow, carrying with them the memory of all who had lived along their banks. The Tigris and Euphrates, which had witnessed the birth of civilization, now flowed through a transformed landscape toward an uncertain future. But in their patient current, the eternal rhythms of life continued, promising that human creativity and achievement would always find new forms of expression, new ways of reaching toward the eternal through the temporal clay of earthly existence. The long goodbye of Mesopotamian civilization was complete, but its legacy would endure, flowing like an underground river through the consciousness of humanity, surfacing in unexpected places and times to remind us of our common heritage as builders of cities and dreamers of dreams in the ancient land between the rivers. Ezra's Wonder, 626 to 539 BC. From the ashes of Nineveh, like a phoenix rising from its own pyre, emerged a new vision of empire that would make the ancient world gasp in wonder. The Babylonians, who had been vassals and subjects for so long, suddenly found themselves masters of the greatest empire the world had ever known. But this would not be an empire built on terror and systematic brutality like the Assyrian colossus they had overthrown. This would be something entirely different, an empire of splendor, learning, and architectural magnificence that would capture the imagination of humanity for all time. The architect of this transformation was Nabopolassar, the Chaldean chieftain who had led the rebellion against Assyrian rule. The Chaldeans were a Semitic people who had settled in the marshlands of southern Mesopotamia, where they had developed a sophisticated understanding of astronomy and mathematics while maintaining their independence from the great powers that fought over the river valleys. They brought to Babylon not just military prowess, but a scholarly tradition that would revolutionize human understanding of the cosmos. But it was Nabopolassar's son, Nebuchadnezzar II, who would transform Babylon from a regional power into the wonder of the ancient world. This king, whose name meant Nabu, protect my boundary stone, ruled from 605 to 562 BC, and in those 43 years created an empire that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, from the Caucasus Mountains to the borders of Egypt. Yet Nebuchadnezzar was a conqueror unlike any who had come before. Where the Assyrians had razed cities and scattered populations, he rebuilt and beautified. Where they had ruled through fear, he governed through magnificence. His empire was not held together by the terror of his armies, but by the sheer awe-inspiring grandeur of his capital city, which became a magnet for traders, scholars, and craftsmen from every corner of the known world. The transformation of Babylon began with its walls. Nebuchadnezzar encircled his city with a double wall so massive that chariots could race along its top. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing a century later, claimed that the walls were over 300 feet high and 80 feet thick, though modern archaeology suggests these figures were exaggerated by the wonderstruck Greeks who first beheld them. What is certain is that the walls of Babylon were the most impressive fortifications the ancient world had ever seen, a statement in stone that this city was intended to endure forever. But the walls were merely the beginning. Nebuchadnezzar's architects and engineers transformed Babylon into a paradise of gardens, palaces, and temples that seemed to defy the laws of physics. The Ishtar Gate, the main entrance to the city, was faced with brilliant blue glazed bricks and decorated with golden reliefs of lions, bulls, and dragons. The processional way, which led from the gate to the heart of the city, was paved with white limestone and red breccia, its walls lined with glazed brick reliefs of striding lions, the symbol of Ishtar. At the center of this magnificent city rose the greatest ziggurat ever built, the Etemenanki, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth. This massive structure, which may have inspired the biblical story of the Tower of Babel, rose in 7 terraced stages to a height of nearly 300 feet. At its summit stood a blue-glazed temple where the god Marduk was said to descend each night to sleep in his golden bed. The ziggurat was not merely a religious building, but a cosmic symbol, representing the connection between earth and heaven, between human ambition and divine power. But perhaps the most famous of Nebuchadnezzar's achievements were the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, which were listed by the Greeks as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. These gardens, if they existed as described, were an engineering marvel that seemed to defy nature itself. Built on a series of terraces supported by vaulted chambers, they were watered by an elaborate system of pumps and channels that lifted water from the Euphrates to the highest levels of the garden. The gardens were said to have been built for Nebuchadnezzar's wife, Amytis, who was homesick for the green hills of her native Media. Whether this romantic story is true or not, the gardens represented something unprecedented in the ancient world: the conquest of nature through technology, the transformation of the harsh Mesopotamian landscape into a paradise of perpetual spring. The biblical account of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, while filtered through the lens of Hebrew religious belief, provides vivid glimpses of the king's character and achievements. The Book of Daniel tells of a monarch obsessed with dreams and omens, who built a great statue of gold and demanded that all his subjects worship it. The Book of Kings describes his siege of Jerusalem and the deportation of the Jewish elite to Babylon, where they would create some of the most beautiful and haunting literature in human history. The Babylonian exile, as it came to be known, was not the brutal mass deportation that had characterized Assyrian policy. The Jews were not scattered across the empire but were settled in communities near Babylon, where they were free to practice their religion and maintain their cultural identity. It was during this exile that much of the Hebrew Bible was compiled and edited, as Jewish scholars sought to preserve their traditions in a foreign land. The exile also led to a profound theological revolution. The Jews, confronted with the reality of foreign rule and the destruction of their temple, began to develop a new understanding of their God as a universal deity who controlled the destiny of all nations. The prophet Ezekiel, writing in exile, described visions of God's throne chariot that could travel anywhere in the world, while the unknown prophet, known as Second Isaiah, proclaimed that the God of Israel was the creator and ruler of all nations. This theological revolution had profound implications for the development of monotheistic religion. The idea that one God controlled all of history, that foreign conquerors were instruments of divine will, that exile and suffering could be part of a divine plan. These concepts would influence not only Judaism, but also Christianity and Islam,